So there is a test that predicts how well you're going to age and even your risk of dying early, more accurately than almost anything else we've measured. It takes about 10 seconds. It requires no equipment, no gym, no preparation. Most people have never heard of it, and when they try it for the first time, a significant proportion of these people discover something about their body that they really weren't expecting. Now, the reason this test works has nothing to do with fitness in the way that most people think about it. It comes down to something that your body is quietly losing every single year, starting much earlier than you'd expect, and something that has consequences that go far beyond how strong you feel day to day. Right then, so let's do the test then. So what I want you to do is to sit down on the floor, not on a sofa, not on a chair, but on your floor. And then stand back up without using your hands. Not touching the floor, not grabbing anything, not using a knee as a lever. Just sit down on the floor and stand back up without touching anything. And here's how it's scored, because this isn't just pass or fail. There are actually scores to this test. So you start with 10 points. Every time you use a hand to get down or up, you lose a point. Every time you use a knee, you lose a point. If you wobble noticeably on the way down or up, you lose half a point. Now, a perfect score obviously is 10, down and then up, completely clean with no support at all. Most people in their 50s score somewhere between 5 and 8. Below 5 is where the research starts to get a bit more uncomfortable. So a study following over 2,000 middle-aged adults found that people who scored 3 or below had a mortality rate nearly 5 times higher over the following 13 years compared to those who scored 8 or above. 5 times higher from something that you just did in your living room in 10 seconds. And the reason that number is so revealing isn't really about whether you can get off the floor or not. It's about what getting off the floor actually requires and what it tells us about everything else going on inside your body. Getting up from the floor without using your hands isn't a simple movement. It's not completely easy for most people. It requires your quadriceps, which are the large muscles across the front of your thighs. It needs these to generate enough force to drive you upward from a position where they're fully loaded. It requires your glutes, your hip flexors, your core, and your calf muscles to coordinate in a very specific sequence with the right timing to keep you balanced while that happens. It requires your nervous system to orchestrate all of that in real time. And it requires enough muscle mass to actually sort of lift you up off the floor when all of those systems fire off. So what the test is really picking up on isn't just one thing, but a cluster of things. Your muscle mass, your neuromuscular coordination, your balance, your joint mobility, and something else called your functional reserve, which is basically your body's buffer. It's your body's ability to cope with stress, to absorb a fall, to recover from illness, and handle a bad week. Think of this like the difference between a car with a full tank of spare fuel and one running on fumes. Both cars might look identical sitting on the driveway, but the moment something goes wrong, they respond very differently. Functional reserve is so important here. And muscle is the physical version of that reserve. And the problem, the thing that makes this very urgent rather than just a bit interesting, is that the loss starts much earlier than most people realise. And it starts very silently. So from your mid-30s onwards, we all begin losing muscle unless we do something about it. Now, this isn't dramatic. You won't really notice it week to week. It is roughly 1 to 2% per year to begin with, but accelerating after the age of 50 to somewhere between 1.5% and 3% a year, and then faster still after that. By the time somebody reaches their late 70s, they may have already lost 30 to 50% of the muscle mass that they had in their prime. Now, the muscles that are most affected are the type 2 fibers, which are the fast twitch muscle fibers that generate explosive force, that catch you when you fall, or that power you up out of a chair. The slow twitch endurance fibers hold up better with age. Fast twitch fibers shrink and disappear disproportionately, and those are exactly the fibers that you were using during that standing test. Most people never feel this happening as a distinct event. They just feel slightly weaker, slightly more tired, slightly less capable than they used to be. Now, most people just put this down to aging. They just adjust and get on with life, and they stop doing things that feel harder. And that adjustment, that gradual withdrawal from physical challenge, actually accelerates the loss, because muscle, unlike almost any other tissue in your body, requires regular challenge to maintain itself. If you stop using it, well, you lose it, it shrinks. Now, the medical name for this is sarcopenia, and it's one of the most underappreciated health crises in modern medicine. Not because it's rare, but because it's so normal that we've stopped questioning it. Most people think of muscle purely in terms of how you look or how strong you feel. But skeletal muscle, the stuff you can see, particularly the large muscles of the legs and the hips, like the quads and the glutes and the hamstrings, skeletal muscle is one of the most important metabolic organs in your entire body. When you eat carbohydrates and glucose arrives in your blood, your muscles are responsible for clearing somewhere between 70 and 80% of it. They are the primary destination for your blood sugar. They are the main reason your glucose levels don't stay dangerously elevated after a meal. The quadriceps alone, being the largest muscle group in the body, play an outsized role in this mechanism. So when your muscle mass declines, your ability to handle food declines with it. Glucose that would previously have been absorbed sits in the blood for longer. Your pancreas has to release more insulin to manage it. And over time, your cells become less sensitive to that insulin. And this is one of the earliest, most common steps towards type 2 diabetes and towards the whole cascade of metabolic dysfunction that sits behind heart disease and fatty liver and a cluster of other conditions that we tend to think of as separate problems, but which very often share the same root. Losing muscle is not just about physical change. It is a metabolic event, and most people have no idea. But underneath that metabolic picture is something even more fundamental. So skeletal muscle is where the vast majority of your mitochondria live, which are the structures inside your cells that generate energy, that take glucose and fat and convert them into fuel that your body actually runs on. The relationship goes both ways. More muscle means more mitochondria, and more mitochondria means a bigger, more efficient energy engine. It means better metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch smoothly between burning carbohydrates and burning fat, depending on what's available. When muscle mass drops as we get older, particularly the large muscles of the lower body that are so metabolically active, that engine genuinely gets smaller. The mitochondria reduce in both number and efficiency, and I did a video on this a couple of days ago. This is one of the main biological reasons that people describe feeling more tired and more sluggish and feeling less sharp as they get older. Not because of age itself as some abstract force, but because their metabolic engine has genuinely contracted. And this is reversible. Even into your 70s and 80s, muscle tissue retains the ability to respond to the right stimulus. New mitochondria can literally be generated. The engine can be rebuilt, but you have to actually do something about it. Working in emergency medicine for the last 10 years, I see where this sort of stuff ends up, and it's worth being really clear about because it changes how you think about all of this. The patient who comes in after a fall, often a relatively minor one like a trip up the step or a stumble out of the bath, very often they've broken their hip. And hip fractures are one of the most significant events in an older person's life, not just because of the fracture itself, but because of what follows after it. Around a third of people who suffer a hip fracture do not return to independent living. The 1-year mortality rate, the proportion of people who die within a year of that fracture, sits somewhere between 20 and 30% in older people, and that is massive. And the muscles most relevant here are the same ones the sit to stand test is measuring. The quadriceps, the glutes, the hip stabilizers. When those muscles are strong, they slow a fall down, they absorb the impact, they give you the split second of reactivity that means a stumble stays a stumble rather than becoming a fall and then a fracture. And when those muscles are weak and what we call atrophied, a trip on a step becomes a hip fracture, and that becomes a hospital admission, and that becomes far too often a permanent loss of independence. This is really important stuff to know about as you get older. This is the end of the road that starts very quietly with losing muscle in your 30s and 40s without doing anything about it. Now, what really surprised me when I started going quite deep into this sort of research is that muscle isn't only protecting your body, it is actively maintaining your brain. So when muscle fibers contract during any kind of physical activity, including something as simple as getting up from the floor, they release these signaling molecules called myokines. One of the most studied of these myokines crosses the blood-brain barrier and increases your levels of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is essentially a growth and maintenance signal for your brain cells. It basically supports the formation of new connections in the brain. It underpins memory and learning, and it appears to be very protective against cognitive decline as well. And the mechanism makes perfect sense when you put all of this together. So your brain and your muscles evolved together. Movement was always how humans survived, and the brain developed a system that stayed sharp, partly in response to the signals that movement generates. When muscle mass declines as you get older and physical activity drops, you're not just losing physical capacity, you are reducing one of the most consistent biological inputs that your brain depends on. Every time you move a muscle, your brain gets an enormous amount of information. Exercise currently is the single most evidence-backed intervention for reducing your risk of dementia, stronger than any supplement, stronger than any drug. And the muscle producing those signals is a significant part of why. Let's just zoom out a bit for a moment. So beyond the individual biology here, there is a broader context worth saying out loud. So we all know that healthcare systems across the Western world are under enormous and growing pressure. In the UK, the NHS is not really functioning that well. Waiting times are getting longer. Access to specialist care is getting harder as well. The ability to manage chronic disease proactively, to catch things early, to intervene before they become a crisis, is shrinking really quickly. And in that environment, the people who are most vulnerable are the ones who depend really heavily on the healthcare system. The more metabolic dysfunction that you carry, the more medications you need, the more appointments, the more monitoring, the more interventions. But building muscle, improving your metabolic health, maintaining your physical resilience, these things aren't just personally beneficial, they are, in a very practical sense, a way of reducing your dependence on a system that is increasingly unable to absorb that dependence. The patients I see who bounce back quickly, who recover, who go home and just get on with their lives, they almost always had one thing in common. They had reserve, they had that buffer, and most of them had muscle. Now, knowing all of this information is only really useful if it changes something. So here's what the evidence actually points to specifically. The foundation is daily movement. So walking, taking the stairs, getting on the floor and getting back up, moving in ways that require your body to produce force. If you're somebody who does their shopping, who does the gardening, who gets out and about to see friends and family, you're probably doing a lot of this already. Walking is really, really underrated as a metabolic intervention, and I've done lots of videos on walking in the past. And the evidence behind it for your cardiovascular and metabolic health is really strong. But walking alone won't preserve the fast twitch muscle fibers that the sit to stand test is actually measuring. For that, you need progressive resistance training, 3 sessions a week as a minimum, 15 to 25 minutes each. And that is not a lot. And you need to be working hard enough that the last few reps feel like genuinely difficult. For this, you do not need a gym. You don't need to spend any money at all. Bodyweight squats or split squats or hip hinges or step-ups, these are training exactly the muscles that we've been talking about here, and you can do this with no equipment at all. Your quads and your glutes and your hamstrings and your hip flexors, these are all utilized when you do squats and hip hinges and lunges as well. If you do these consistently and progressively, well, they really work. They are so powerful, even without any weight. On protein, there is a specific detail that often gets missed, and it matters far more after the age of 40 than most people realize. So something called anabolic resistance develops as you age. Your muscle tissue basically becomes less responsive to the signal from dietary protein to build and repair itself. What this means practically is that you need significantly more protein than you did in your 20s to achieve the same muscle maintaining effect. The current evidence points to around 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day for people in midlife who are actually trying to maintain their muscle, who are training. And that is much higher than the standard dietary guidelines actually give you. And spreading it across your meals matters as well. And really, you need to try and get this from whole foods if you can. Your body can only really absorb around 30 or 40 grams for muscle protein synthesis at any one sitting. What this means is that a large protein hit at dinner with maybe a shake and some steak with very little earlier in the day is less effective than distributing it across your entire day. Eggs and meat and fish and legumes, dairy, Greek yogurt, all of these are really, really good sources. Whatever score you got in that test a few minutes ago, this was a snapshot of your quadricep strength, your hip power, your neuromuscular coordination, your metabolic health, and your functional reserve. A window into a system that has been changing quietly for years and years. And if what you saw was uncomfortable, if your number was lower than you were expecting, then this is really useful information. Because unlike your genetics, unlike your age, unlike a lot of what actually shapes your health outcomes, muscle is absolutely modifiable. The biology responds to stimulus at any age. You can build muscle however old you are. You just have to start. Start slow, start where you are, and build up gradually.